Hi, everyone. Welcome back to this interview I'm doing with Jim Bennett, who is the author of A Faithful Response to the CES Letter. This is part two. In part one, we talked a little bit about Jim. He sort of talked about his background, growing up in the church, talked about his mission, and sort of like what motivated him to write a response to the CES Letter. And, he talked about going on different podcasts and meeting with Jeremy. And then we had a discussion talking about some of the criticisms with regards to the Book of Mormon. So we're going to be finishing talking about Book of Mormon anachronisms and other criticisms with the Book of Mormon, and talk then a little bit more about the Book of Mormon translation, and hopefully get on to the Book of Abraham in this section as well. So I'm really grateful and I'm having fun. Jim, hope you're having fun too.
I'm having a blast. I wouldn't be doing it if it weren't fun.
I know. Awesome. So we're talking about Book of Mormon anachronisms, and so Jeremy talked about how there's anachronisms in the Book of Mormon, horses, goats, or sheep, steel, elephants, and that there's a lack of archaeological evidence for the Book of Mormon. You sort of address that. You don't feel like that's a fair representation, saying that there's absolutely no archaeological evidence. We talked about Lehi's travel through the Arabian deserts and Nahum and Bountiful, and how those are very strong parallels for the Book of Mormon's historicity, at least in the old world. You also talk about in your response how there's less anachronisms over time with the Book of Mormon. So there still are some anachronisms, but there's less over time. And you also talk about that only like less than 1% of the Americas, Mesoamerica, has been excavated, and then with recent LiDAR technology, we've discovered cities and roads and highways. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, I steal all of my information on that from my father. My father wrote a book called Leap of Faith, Confronting the Origins of the Book of Mormon. And I would recommend most of that book to anybody, provided they skip over my dad's desire to summarize the Book of Mormon. He wrote that during Mitt Romney's presidential campaign and thought that everybody outside the church was going to be interested in the church. And so he wrote these lengthy summaries of the Book of Mormon, which somehow managed to be more boring than the Book of Mormon itself in those passages.
Hope you didn't tell him that.
No, he's passed away now. So anyway, best leave that alone. But the one thing he does do that I don't think anybody else does, he describes his experience working for Howard Hughes. Do you know who Howard Hughes was?
No.
That, again, you are showing your age or lack thereof. Howard Hughes was the Elon Musk of his day. He was the wealthiest man in the world, I think, or at least certainly the wealthiest American. And may have been the world's first billionaire. And he was nuts. There's a movie about him called The Aviator with Leonardo DiCaprio. He at the end of his life, he was living in movie theaters with sitting naked watching movies with Kleenex boxes on his feet, with fingernails that were 5 inches long, and just mentally ill. And he died. He was 79 pounds. He just withered away to nothing, and was just this eccentric, strange man who didn't see anybody live and in person for the last, I don't know how many years of his life, 10 years maybe or more. Anyway, my father worked for him, and his entire inner circle was members of the church. They were the only people he trusted. My father was his head PR guy, and not only did he never meet him, he never even spoke to him. It was just this very strange sort of circumstance. And near the end of his life, there was a novelist by the name of Clifford Irving who got the idea that he would write the autobiography of Howard Hughes. And he got a hold of some material from somebody within the Hughes organization that he used as sort of the framework for his autobiography. And he got $1 million advance for this book. And the Hughes organization, of which my father was part at the time, insisted it wasn't true, denied it over and over again. And this guy says, well, you guys don't know. I've been meeting with him in secret. How would you know? And the last time Howard Hughes ever dealt with the public was he held a teleconference back in a time when there was no such thing as a teleconference. But he got
Right.
a teleconference, he got out and denied it and said this is a hoax and it's nonsense. And this was one of the two big frauds that my father was involved with. He wasn't a perpetrator of the fraud, but the Hughes organization was victim of two different big frauds, the other being a member of the church named Melvin Dumar, who claimed to have met Howard Hughes in the Nevada desert, picked him up hitchhiking. Melvin Dumar was a gas station attendant in Nevada and claimed to have met Howard Hughes, picked him up hitchhiking, and after Howard Hughes died, a will appeared at church headquarters, like a week after Howard Hughes died, that left a 14th of his estate to Melvin Dumar. And this was actually the subject of an Academy Award-winning movie called Melvin and Howard. Mary Steenburgen won Best Supporting Actress for playing Melvin Dumar's wife. And this was, they called it the Mormon Will, and it had some huge anachronisms in it. One being that it made Noah Dietrich, the executor of Hughes's estate, despite the fact that they'd had a huge falling out. And it referred to Howard Hughes's plane as the Spruce Goose. Howard Hughes built what he called the flying boat during World War II that would transport huge troops across the Atlantic. And this plane only flew once and only reached a height of, it was the largest plane in the world. It was made entirely out of pine. So it was a wooden boat plane, and critics called it the Spruce Goose. And Howard Hughes hated the name Spruce Goose, so he would never have put it in his will. Right. And so the point my dad made, and he went through the book by Clifford Irving, which was exposed as a fraud. The point is that frauds have anachronisms in them, but the number of anachronisms grows over time. And the fact of the matter is that you look back on these two frauds, and it's patently obvious with the passage of time that they're fake. And he says the Book of Mormon defies that pattern because, yes, there are anachronisms in it, but there are fewer anachronisms now than there were when the book was published. One of the biggest anachronisms at the time was this idea of ancient people writing things on gold plates and burying them in stone boxes. The Gold Bible, and how absurd an idea that was. And we have since found all kinds of evidence of people finding gold plates in stone boxes. For a while, they used to have a picture of the Darius plates in the Book of Mormon because they were found in a stone box that looks exactly like the one that Joseph Smith described. And they are plates very similar to what Joseph Smith described. And there have been several different examples of the ancients doing that. So that was an anachronism that is now no longer an anachronism. And Lehi's journey was considered anachronistic, particularly because there was the idea that there was no consistently year-round running water anywhere along the Arabian Peninsula. And they've since found, yes, there are. And not only is there running water, but it's in a place exactly where it should be for Lehi's journey to make sense. I mean, so he goes through that and says, all right, so I'm willing to hold in abeyance my doubt of anachronisms like horses. And there was just a recent study, Book of Mormon Central made a big video about it, that they have found horse remains from a time that would be within the Book of Mormon time frame. So maybe that's not an anachronism anymore.
I did a video on that as well. I think it's not definitive or conclusive. It's the surrounding materials, the organic materials like coal and wood and stuff that dates to Book of Mormon times. They haven't tested the collagen in the bones, but I think it's an example of if we've not excavated or dug everything there is to find, then it would be different if everything's been cleared, everything's been searched, and then there's nothing, and then you could say it's anachronistic no archaeological evidence. But whenever I realized that not every single archaeological site has been excavated, that leaves open the possibility of, well, it still could be found in the future.
Well, and the LiDAR data really is astonishing, because it is revealing cities that look an awful lot like, from what I can tell, what's described in the Book of Mormon, with huge highways. And I mean, cement used to be a huge anachronism, and now we find that cement was in fact used in Mesoamerica.
Yeah.
So there are a number of things. It's kind of the same thing with DNA, right? The idea that that we have all the information, and that excludes the possibility that this happened is absurd. And it's particularly absurd in this instance, when we really know very, very little about these ancient civilizations.
Yeah.
And we are discovering things. The people who started the first LiDAR, I mean, I don't know what the term for it is, but the people doing that research have said it's going to take us 100 years to sort through this.
Mm.
And this totally remakes our understanding of ancient America. And so, given how little the Book of Mormon says that allows us to identify specifically where this happened, and given how little we know about the ancient world, it's just really kind of foolhardy to say that, to lean into these anachronisms and say that this is definitive, and say we know everything and that we can't do any of this. So
Yeah. No, that's fair. Jeremy doesn't talk about this in his CES letter, but I'm just going to bring it up because this is a question I have, and it's more of a textual anachronism. One thing I noticed, both even as a missionary, but even as I've recently read through the Book of Mormon, is that there are passages which come from the New Testament, or that
right.
seem near enough identical. And particularly from Paul, I noticed whenever I really studied Paul and read through Paul, I was like, there's a lot of these verses that are near enough identical or
Well,
similar to what's in the Book of Mormon.
yeah.
And
Oh,
a
well,
skeptic,
there's direct quote. I mean, it's more than just somewhat similar, particularly with
yeah, there
regard
are
to
some
Paul.
like Moroni 7 and is it First Corinthians
Moroni 7
13
is
on
in First
charity.
Corinthians, yeah, faith, hope, and charity, and all that. That's a direct lift from the New Testament. There's no question about that.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? Maybe you alluded to this in your view of translation and loose translation and Joe Smith clothing the ideas, because a skeptic or a critic would see it as, he's taking that from the New Testament, word for word. He knows the Bible really well, and he's putting that as he's dictating the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, I
I
don't
don't,
think. I think the evidence that he knew the Bible really well is pretty scant, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest he didn't. But I'm not at all persuaded by a lot of the old school apologetics on that. I know that Bruce R. Mckonkie particularly said there's clearly must have been an ancient source from which both Paul and Moroni were drawing from. Even if that were true, which I don't think it is, the fact that the language is identical, right? If you had an ancient source in Hebrew or Aramaic or whatever else, the idea that Paul or the King James translators and Joseph Smith would have translated those word for word the same way is pretty thin. It wouldn't happen.
yeah.
So I think the only explanation for that makes any sense is that it's a translator's choice. I mean, you don't have to know the Bible pretty well to know the whole idea of faith, hope, and charity the way Paul did. Those are verses that have been part of the public, public zeitgeist and consciousness for hundreds and hundreds of years. Those are some of the most powerful and well-known verses in the New Testament. So my guess is that that's a translator's choice.
Okay.
I mean, it gets back to, are you familiar with the whole idea of the expansion theory of the Book of Mormon?
Yeah.
Um, I'm not sure how much of that I buy into, but part of that helps me. The idea, for instance, that there's something written on the golden plates that is kind of a catalyst for the revelations that Joseph Smith received. I am open to the idea, for instance, that Mormon and Moroni didn't give a rip about the idea of infant baptism, but that infant baptism was an issue that was important to Joseph Smith. And so there's sort of a midrash in Moroni chapter 8,
Yeah.
where this is framed as if Mormon is writing a letter to Moroni. But I mean, I think you have all kinds of scriptural precedent of midrash and things being put in the voice of people, actual people that that weren't necessarily historically accurate in that regard. I mean, Ben Spackman has done a whole lot of work on this with regard to genre in scripture, the idea that the ancients weren't nearly as journalistic in terms of how they reported ideas as we expect them to be. I don't, for instance, think that there is an ounce of the book of Job that bears any resemblance to anything that ever actually happened. I think that is a metaphor. I think that is poetry. I think it is fiction. And I think it was written, I think it was probably a dramatic play, but it was written sort of in a context of framing this in a way that we can draw lessons from it. And I don't think the ancients really cared about that much. And so I don't know how that works in terms of how the Book of Mormon is produced, but I think that that's a translator's choice. And whether that was given to Joseph Smith directly or not, I don't think that Paul and Moroni were drawing from some kind of same source. And I don't have a problem with the idea of being it sort of an additional revelation.
Right.
That you know, so
I know that question as a missionary. I read with a Protestant guy. We were reading Moroni 7, and I remember he said the question, this sounds very similar to 1 Corinthians 13. I remember my Orthodox missionary response was, well, God could give both men the same words. And that sort of sufficed him at the time. But I would tend to agree with you. It's a bit strange that both Moroni and Paul are receiving word for word the same.
Well, but the thing is,
revelation.
Paul didn't receive a word for word revelation that are the words in the English King James Bible. Whatever words Paul wrote. I mean, so the King James Bible is a translator's choice, and the Book of Mormon is a translator's choice. And the translator of the Book of Mormon was comfortable enough with the King James Bible that he was comfortable enough to use those words.
You talk a little about like infant baptism. I know Alexander Campbell, he was like the leader of the Campbellite movement. He said that he felt that a lot of the Book of Mormon talked about like 19th century controversies and Protestantism. Grant Palmer in his book, he talks about either parallels or connections. You might say that they're, strong parallels or maybe not between, Protestant sermons, sort of the phraseology of the time in the Book of Mormon. And, some critics point to, I haven't noticed this as well as a missionary, that a lot of our doctrine, like things to do with, degrees of glory or temple ordinances or, becoming gods, the pre-existence, maybe it's alluded to in one verse, but a lot of those later doctrines aren't really talked about in the Book of Mormon explicitly. And, they would say it almost sounds like a 19th century Protestant sort of style of text. It's very heaven and hell. It's really Christ-centered, focused on the gospel. There's not many of those later doctrines, which are really an important part of our faith. Do you have any thoughts on that? I know it's a sort of a big, wide issue.
No, it's a huge issue, particularly with regard to the 19th century material in the Book of Mormon. People make the case, okay, well, the Book of Mormon was written for our day.
Yeah.
And so obviously that's why Mormon is concerned about infant baptism. Well, I look at that and go, okay, well, it sounds like they're concerned about Joseph Smith's day. but they don't seem to be concerned about the 21st century. I mean, the issues that are facing the church in the 21st century, the Book of Mormon is completely silent. I'm less concerned that it's silent about things like the 3 degrees of glory, and more concerned that it's completely silent on LGBTQ issues. And this is the issue in the 21st century that is ripping the church apart and that is driving the rising generation out of the church. Book of Mormon has nothing to say about it. So when Mormon says, okay, I speak unto you as if you are present, and yet ye are not, but behold, Jesus Christ hath shown me unto you, and I know your doing. Who's doing? Is that Joseph Smith's doing? Is that, our doing in the 21st century? Is that the doing of the people who are going to be here right before the second coming of Christ? And everybody since Joseph Smith's time and our time has think, well, that's us, because Christ is coming next week. I don't know when Jesus is coming, and I don't know if I doubt that will be in my lifetime. But the point being, it's clear to me that that you're seeing to some degree Joseph Smith's concerns and Joseph Smith's contemporaneous 19th century issues being the ones that the Book of Mormon addresses. Is that because Mormon addresses that, or is that because of an expansion theory of the Book of Mormon where
So everyone just had a little bit of technical difficulties. Jim, if you could continue the point you were saying.
Well, yeah. So clearly, the Book of Mormon is addressing Joseph Smith's generation of concerns, and some of those have not necessarily aged well. I don't know, for instance, I can't remember the last time I heard anybody in the 21st century worry about infant baptism one way or the other. That really is a going concern. I'm concerned that the Book of Mormon is completely silent on the great issues of the 21st century, particularly LGBTQ issues. It says absolutely nothing about it. Neither does the Doctrine and Covenants or the Pearl of Great Price, which leads me to suggest that there is greater room for light and knowledge on those. But that's a whole other discussion. But the thing about it is, I think the terms of the 19th century-ness of the Book of Mormon, I think a lot of that can be contributed, would suggest that Joseph Smith is an active participant in this in a way beyond just being a newsreader. But I also think it's overstated to the fact that, yes, there are lots of things in the church that aren't talked about in the Book of Mormon, but the centrality of the atonement, our understanding of the atonement, I think the majority of our understanding of that comes from the Book of Mormon and continues to rely on the Book of Mormon to teach that with a clarity and a power that you don't find anywhere else, including the New Testament. The kinds of difficulties that other churches have in understanding what is the nature of the atonement, what is the nature of the resurrection, the idea that we are resurrected physically is something that a lot of other churches no longer believe. They talk about a spiritual resurrection rather than a physical resurrection. We know from the Book of Mormon that it's a physical resurrection. I mean, a lot of the core solid doctrines, that doctrine of baptism by immersion, a lot of these things that we just sort of take for granted, the bedrock for those doctrines is in the Book of Mormon. And that has survived beyond the controversies of the 19th century into the 21st century and beyond, which suggests to write off the Book of Mormon as just sort of a 19th century anachronism is, I think, really dismissive of a substantive work that has a whole lot more going on than that.
Yeah, no, I think the 19th century elements in there, that's probably what I wrestle with most when it comes to the Book of Mormon. I care not as much about the anachronisms. Again, there's things that bother different people in different ways. Whenever I look at maybe some of the prophecies in the Book of Mormon. Whenever I read about, the prophecy of John, baptizing Jesus, or Christopher Columbus, discovering the
Yeah.
Americas, or Martin Harris taking the characters to Charles Anton, and although it doesn't say that explicitly, but when you read that, sometimes you think like, oh, is this kind of convenient? Because
Yeah.
although it happened way after, Nephi or whoever wrote it, it was before Joseph. And are these the words of Joseph or not? But then, yeah, you pointed that there's maybe other elements of the text that seem like it's beyond Joseph's, perhaps you might say, capabilities, or showed it being maybe an ancient origin.
Well, the one of the things my father says in his book, my father says there are only three plausible explanations for the Book of Mormon's existence. One is the one Joseph Smith gives. Whether you think that's plausible or not depends on your faith, obviously. The second is that Joseph Smith wrote it. And the third is that a third party wrote it and Joseph Smith took credit for it. And he said, at the time the Book of Mormon was published, the one theory that nobody was willing to consider was theory number 2, that Joseph
Yeah.
Smith. Everybody at the time insisted that Joseph Smith did not have the resources, did not have the capacity to have written it, and insisted that it was written by a third party. And this is where you get the Spalding theory and, Sidney Rigdon. The idea is that the Spalding theory, there was a manuscript that Joseph Smith stole, and Sidney Rigdon added a bunch of religious stuff to it and then pretended to join the church when they met. The problem is they've actually found the Spalding manuscript, which bears absolutely no resemblance to the Book of Mormon. I mean, with regard to the CES letter, this I think is what my big overarching argument against Jeremy Runnels in the CES letter and the Book of Mormon is you have too many different explanations for where the Book of Mormon came from.
I was
And
going to
every
talk about
time,
that next, because he cites, he might have, I think plagiarize might be a misrepresentation from what I've listened to critics. They think he may have been influenced, perhaps borrowed ideas, or maybe some of the language from books like View of the Hebrews. And, Jeremy points out some of the parallels that I believe B.H. Roberts showed between the two books. Maybe you could talk briefly about your thoughts on the View of the Hebrews, and he also cites the Book of Napoleon, Late War, that have some similar sounding 19th century language. And critics, I don't think, would say that he's necessarily plagiarizing from these books, but perhaps he was aware of them, perhaps he's read them, but we don't have evidence. But perhaps that is influencing the Book of Mormon text if he is the author. Just share your thoughts on that.
I remember the first time I heard of View of the Hebrews was the God Makers, and it terrified me.
Yeah.
I went, wait a minute, there's this book, because the God Makers, the idea is, well, Joseph Smith just took the View of the Hebrews and passed it off as the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
That's essentially the argument. And I didn't have access to View of the Hebrews. This is the pre-internet time when I don't know that I would have had no idea how to find the Book of the Hebrews. And that made me feel like the biggest chump in the world. What it also tells me, anybody that makes that argument has never spent 5 minutes looking at View of the Hebrews, because 5 minutes is enough to disabuse you of any notion that the View of the Hebrews has anything whatsoever to do with the Book of Mormon. And I do that in my reply. I say, here's a page. Just look at this page from the View of the Hebrews. Read this. And the View of the Hebrews is a 60, and I really resent the fact that I had to read the entirety of the Book of the Hebrews to write my piece, because it's exceptionally boring and it's stupid. It's not stupid, but it's arguing. It's making the argument that the Native Americans are the lost tribes of Israel. It is not a story, right? It's not. There are no Nephites, Lamanites, and there are no characters in the View of the Hebrews. It's an essay.
Right.
It's a 40,000 word essay, and none of the arguments that it makes are arguments with any parallel in the Book of Mormon. Nobody makes similar arguments. The only thing they have in common of any significance is that they posit a Hebrew origin to the Native Americans. And so, yes, could Joseph Smith have read the view of the Hebrews and gotten that idea? Sure, absolutely he could have. But then you have to account for, 365,000 words that Joseph ended up writing that bear no resemblance to the view of the Hebrews. It's like saying, I have an idea. Jesus comes back, but he's really an alien, right? I give you that idea, and then you end up writing a screenplay about that, and I write a screenplay about that, and they're completely different. But you say, "Oh, geez, you plagiarized me." It doesn't work that way. The other ones, the late war, the
Book of Napoleon.
Book of Napoleon. The only thing they've got in common with the Book of Mormon is that they use King James language. That's it. I mean, the stories aren't the same. The characters aren't the same. Nothing. Those two don't have anything to do with ancient America. They don't have to do with lost tribes of Israel. I mean, the parallels in those are ridiculous.
And there's large chunks between some of the ellipses as well.
Oh, the ellipses are ridiculous.
The language does seem somewhat similar, and that's something I didn't realize.
The language seems similar because both are designed to sound like the King James Bible. The language is similar to the King James Bible, the Book of Mormon. So I mean, it's not a separate argument. The idea that any book that sounds like the King James Bible could be a subject of plagiarism for the Book of Mormon is kind of ridiculous. If Joseph was plagiarizing anything, he was plagiarizing the Bible.
Yeah.
Why go to the late war to plagiarize the Bible? So you can make the argument, okay, well, it's got huge chunks of Isaiah in there, and we've already talked about the New Testament and all that kind of stuff. That's the more compelling argument. But the idea that Joseph took the late war and did anything with it, that it was in any way useful to him, doesn't make any sense. There's certain...
Plus, a critic might think subconsciously, if he had read it, he's influenced. Like, say, for example, if I were to write a script for a new TV show, I may be subconsciously influenced by ideas or stories from previous TV shows or movies I've watched. Right. Maybe that's being incorporated in a more subconscious way.
Well,
again, that's speculation.
No, but I mean, I wish I had memorized Hugh Nibley's analogy. He's like, people look at Joseph Smith and assume Joseph Smith said something like, "Draw me a circle and I will give you a Swiss watch." I mean, the amount of valuable source material that Joseph could have drawn from these works, assuming he had been poring over them and cared about them, what he could have actually gotten is so minuscule compared to what he produced. Even with View of the Hebrews, if he copied it word for word, that gives him 40,000 words, and he has to come up with another 325,000 words to finish the Book of Mormon.
So it doesn't really simply show how he did it.
It doesn't show anything that beyond a sort of broad thematic consistency between the two.
Yeah.
It doesn't show how this guy could have written the thing that I'm really impressed by with the Book of Mormon is that it's a first draft. If you've written anything of any length, you know how long it takes to revise and refine and go back. And the idea of just sitting and dictating a first draft without any corrections and publishing it is ludicrous. There isn't anybody on earth that can do that. And so then you have to go back and say, well, Joseph, and critics say, well, yeah, but he had really written it 3 years earlier and this, that, and the other. You really don't have any evidence that suggests that's the case. everybody he dictated it to, and you had other witnesses, showed that he didn't have anything. He wasn't reading from a manuscript.
Yeah.
If he had written it years earlier, then he would have had to have memorized it. And the idea that he memorized the Book of Mormon is, who's capable of memorizing that and holding that for 3 years? And that would have left some kind of historical footprint. The idea that he's writing this out, memorizing, there isn't any kind of indication that that would have been possible. And based on what people knew about Joseph Smith's education and experience and background, the idea that he could have produced this was a ludicrous idea in the 19th century. And only with the benefit of hindsight, for those of us who didn't know Joseph Smith when he was alive, are we able to say, well, clearly there doesn't seem to be any indication a third party wrote it. Clearly this just must have been Joseph Smith, just sort of making it up and pulling it all out of a hat, literally, with his rock. You know, I continually say this. This isn't really an area where I base my faith, but I have yet to see a persuasive secular explanation for the origins of the Book of Mormon. I am open to one. I would like, but I haven't seen it.
Yeah.
And the fact that Jeremy comes up with, you know, half a dozen possibilities for how it does means that there is not one sort of clear, coherent answer. I use an analogy from my business school days. I got an MBA from BYU, and my finance professor said there are four different ways to calculate the net present value of an asset. And he said, "Do you know what that means, don't you?" And I said, "No, I don't know what that means." He says, "It means that none of them are any good. Because if there were one simple, reliable way to calculate the net present value of an asset, that's the one everyone would use. But since every single one of them has problems, we have to come up with multiple versions." And so people who account for the Book of Mormon have come up with all these multiple versions that wildly conflict with each other. And, you know, you don't have a single theory of the facts that matches the historical record. We don't have anything close to that.
Yeah.
So
I think I would agree with you when it comes to, you know, did Joseph have a secret manuscript that he hid from people? Was he reading from a book? Like, we have the witnesses, like Emma saying, you know, he had no script or book. She would have known if he did. I think the best naturalistic explanation that I have heard, if I'm steel manning the argument, which I want to try to do, I think they would see it as Joseph Smith knew the Bible. He was going to Methodist and Protestant sermons, and he was absorbing everything in his surroundings like a sponge. You know, Lucy talks about in her history, he was telling sort of stories about the Native Americans and, you know, sort of like their, you know, their warfare and what they traveled and, you know, things like that. And, you know, they would say that maybe he had these stories. He was telling these stories. He was a gifted storyteller, and he wanted to bring people to Christ. He wanted to talk about, you know, how the Native Americans came from Israel, and he wanted to convert them. And they would probably say that Joseph was, that he didn't have it memorized per se, but that he was able to dictate it. Maybe he had like a rough plan, dictate it, but they would point to, well, there seems to be elements that seem 19th century, or Lehi's dream seems like his father's dream, or it seems to be quoting the King James Bible or the New Testament, like we've talked about, or, you know, Deuteronomy. And they would point to these things where, like, they might say, oh, well, we don't know exactly how he did it, but they could point to things that seem to have Joseph Smith's fingerprints, so to speak, or like textual anachronisms.
Well, the Book of Mormon has Joseph Smith's fingerprints all over it. I think any book has its any translated work has fingerprints of the translator all over it. The King James Bible has the fingerprints of the King James translators all over it to some degree. So I mean, that doesn't surprise me at all. But the thing is, when you're talking, he absorbed this like a sponge. I said, did he absorb the ability to lay out a consistent geography of events over the course of 365,000 words that is internally consistent with itself over. I mean,
that is impressive.
I mean, and it's done so casually, right? It's done without ever really kind of calling attention to itself. It's just, this is the way it was. I mean, that's extraordinarily difficult to do with somebody that sits and maps it out and does that, and just to sort of dictate that, and always have the land bountiful and the land of Zarahemla and all in exactly the right place in reference to itself.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much more complexity to the Book of Mormon, and Joseph, if he were the author of it, just makes it look so easy because he doesn't try to call attention to it. I go back to Orson Scott Card as a science fiction writer. He says you can always tell in a science fiction story what era it was written in because of the conventions of what was written and all that. And he uses the example of Robert Heinlein wrote in Stranger. He's a science fiction writer. I don't remember the name of the book. But he talks about going out a door, and he describes how the door dilated. And they walked through this door because the door, and he said, except if you were living in that fictional universe, you wouldn't say the door dilated. You'd say the door opened. The author used the word dilated because we, in our world, know that doors don't dilate. They open and close on a hinge. And so that tells you something about the writer. And he says there are all kinds of things. He says one of the things in the Book of Mormon is that no one rides anywhere. There's never a point where somebody gets on horseback and rides anywhere. We have paintings by Arnold Freeberg where the sons of Helaman are all on horseback, but that's not in the Book of Mormon. He says, and I can say when I'm talking to somebody in a crowd that I flew there to talk to them, and they all know that I got on an airplane and did that. But an ancient audience, if I said I flew there, would think maybe I'm talking about flying Superman style or flapping my arms. He says the Book of Mormon never calls attention to these kinds of details that would have made perfect sense in Nephite culture, but would be unusual in modern culture or in a 19th century culture. The fact that no one rides anywhere, the fact that everybody walks, that's an indication also that when they're referring to horses, that's when you get all the people jumping up and down about tapers, that this is lone shifting, that they're using a word to describe an animal that Joseph Smith would have thought of as a horse, but which the ancients wouldn't necessarily have thought of as a horse. I mean, you get into the weeds on all that kind of stuff.
I don't know what I make of that apologetic, but
I don't either. I don't either. But the point is, there is so much more complexity to the Book of Mormon than just, oh, well, it's just reflects everything of the time. Joseph Smith would have had to do a whole lot more legwork than just about anybody alive would have been able to do to pull off what he pulled off. And there's no indication that he did that.
Yeah.
There's just no indication in the historical record that he did that. But it just becomes very difficult to figure out secularly how this book got here. And the critics, I think, have it's open season on the Book of Abraham. They have a very clear, logical explanation for how that got here. But the Book of Mormon, I don't think they've laid a finger on it.
It's pretty remarkable, the Book of Mormon, whether or not you believe it was supernatural by the gift and power of God or the naturalistic theory. And I've often thought, like, if it is from Joseph Smith, 531 pages, part of me thinking if he's pulling off a fraud, or if it's a pious fraud, why not 50 pages? Why not, like,
right?
Why such a long book?
Right. The longer, my dad talks about this in his book. He says forgeries are easier to uncover the longer they are.
Yeah.
You open yourself up to exposing stuff. It's one of the reasons Mark Hoffman got caught is that everything Mark Hoffman forged was like a page long. And then he started talking about the McLennan papers. And so he had to forge books and diaries that were lengthy. That's a whole lot harder. And he wanted to forge the 116 lost pages of the Book of Mormon. And that's what he couldn't do it. He couldn't produce
it. Yeah.
it. And so he ended up blowing people up to buy himself more time.
My good friend, our good friend RFM, when I was talking to him about the Book of Mormon, and we don't need to get too much more into this because we've talked very extensively about it, but he talked about, how Mark Hoffman was pretty much, it was disproven that it was, or it was proven it was a forgery, finding just one anachronism, and that was all they needed. And whenever I talk with him, with the Book of Mormon, it's like there seems to be evidence for it, things that look good, and then maybe there's some things that make it seem like a 19th century work, or you might say that seems like an anachronism. And his view is one anachronism, you know, proves the whole thing is not true.
No, he's right. One definitive anachronism is, if John Dehlin always says, it's like reading a book about George Washington and then George Washington pulls out his cell phone.
Yeah.
Now, if Nephi pulled out a cell phone, and verily I say unto thee, I shall text thee on my cell phone, that would be enough to disprove the Book of Mormon. But the problem is that the anachronisms they're citing are not as definitive as they want to suggest. The fact that the Book of Mormon mentions horses, it seems likely that horses are an anachronism based on what we know now. But is it possible that there were horses? Yes, it is possible. It remains possible. There isn't an anachronism in the Book of Mormon that absolutely, this is impossible, this could not have existed, in the way that George Washington with a cell phone is just that kind of an anachronism.
Okay. Right, let's talk about the rock in the hat, because Jeremy
Yeah.
harps on about this a bit. So we've talked a little bit about the Book of Mormon translation. I don't know about your upbringing in the church. I had never heard of the Seer stone. A random dude did come up to me on my mission whenever I was a greenie, and because the church released it in 2015. So I
Where
was
did you
just
go
starting
on
my
your
mission.
mission? I think you told me that, but I don't remember where you went.
It was Alberta, Canada.
Oh, Alberta, Canada. Okay.
So,
Cool.
yeah, a random guy came up to me and he was like, Joseph Smith used the seer stone and your church has just announced it. And, we didn't really have, the internet as missionaries. So I just thought, okay, you big loony. I'd never heard of it. To be fair, I didn't know much about the Urim and Thummim. I didn't actually think I know what the Urim and Thummim even was until my mission. I think I asked a companion. He was like, oh, yeah, it's like two stones and glasses. I was like, oh, that's weird. Um,
Yeah.
but it wasn't until I came home from my mission and talked with my sister who had left, and the seer stone was one of her biggest issues, and then I sort of learned about it. Now, some apologists would say, like, God can use a physical object to, reveal his word, to a prophet. Is the seer stone any weirder than, a Urim and Thummim? Or they cite examples in the Old Testament, like Moses and his rod. But some critics feel that it's the fact that Joseph Smith used a seer stone, and there's lots of people claiming to be seers in 19th century sort of frontier America. It was quite a common practice of using a stone to see and find lost objects, or to use it in treasure digging, and that Joseph Smith was hired as a treasure seer. In his youth, he worked for Josiah Stowell, and he had a reputation as a treasure seer. And some people say he did genuinely have this gift to be able to find lost objects. Some people did genuinely believe he had this gift. Other people thought he's a con man, he's a fraud. Some people think the fact that no treasure was ever found calls into question, this would be Dan Vogel's sort of view, if he was conning people when using the stone at times, can we then trust if you use that same stone for the production of the Book of Mormon per se? Now, you might push back. You may not think he was conning people. Richard Bushman has maybe the interpretation that, maybe he was experimenting with his spiritual powers. Maybe the stone worked in some circumstances, but maybe he was misusing his spiritual powers when it came to treasure. Or maybe he was just experimenting with folk magic, and then God was able to use the stone when it came to doing, his work, and that he speaks to people according to their culture, language, etc. Could you just comment your thoughts on that?
Just on the Rock and the Hat generally, or I mean,
maybe briefly on the treasure digging as well. And
well, the treasure digging. So my assessment of Joseph Smith on a personal level, in terms of my assessing him as a person, is that Joseph Smith was a believer in himself and in his prophetic mission and everything else. That does not mean that Joseph Smith was a prophet. But it does mean that Joseph Smith believed he was a prophet.
Well, that's Dan Vogel's position, pious fraud theory, which I would agree with that. I don't believe, if I were to not believe he was a prophet, because whenever I first lost my faith, I thought complete con man, sexual predator, false prophet. And then the more I read, the Saints volumes, Rough Stone Rolling, Dan Vogel, I was like, I think this is too black and white view of Joseph Smith.
I mean, so the fact that Joseph Smith believed he was a prophet, informs a lot of that early treasure digging and early everything else. I think Joseph Smith believed he could find buried treasure. I don't think that he could, but I think he believed he could. If that makes sense. And the 1826 looking glass hearing, it wasn't really a formal trial. Josiah Stoll, who is the person who was supposedly defrauded, is the reason Joseph Smith wasn't ever charged, because he showed up and said, no, Joseph Smith's great, and he did this for me, and I believe in him too. I don't really care much about the treasure digging stuff. I don't see anything particular. I don't know. I just don't. It doesn't make much of a difference to me. Even if Joseph, as a teenager, was messing around and doing silly things, and I mean, I did silly,
deceive.
I don't know. I don't know, and I don't really much care. I remember what I was like when I was 15 and 16 years old, and if I'm going to be held accountable for eternally for whatever it was I did then, I'd be in serious trouble probably.
And you could interpret it, because I know when he was 17, he was praying. In his history, he talks about dabbling in companies shouldn't be, and I think there was an account, was it from Martin Harris, that he got reprimanded by the angel for being involved with the money diggers, and maybe he had to repent to be worthy in order to obtain the place. You could view it as maybe he was misusing his spiritual powers, maybe he was being greedy as well. There was an interesting quote I did in my research that I found. It was from Alva Hale, who was a cousin of Emma, and this quote seemed kind of credible to me, because he quoted Joseph Smith telling him, and Joseph Smith said that, look, this peeping in stones to find treasure is all nonsense. But then Joseph Smith said to him, but being a seer and seeing through a stone is a gift from God. And that quote to me, I was like, I could see some credibility, because if he was just trying to say, he can't see the stone ever, which I think Peter Ingersoll quotes that, I don't think he would then quote the next part of Joseph believing that being a seer and seeing through a stone was a gift from God, and being a seer.
Well, and it's like people say, well, but this is what everybody was doing. And I don't understand why that's a disqualifying statement. I don't understand why Joseph Smith's revelations only have credibility if there is no cultural influence of the time manifest in the revelation. We hear the same thing about the temple ceremony, for instance. Well, it's similar to the Masons. And it's like, well, it seems very, very clear that he went through the Masonic temple ceremony, and that was a catalyst for the revelations on temple ceremonies. I mean, I was taught in primary that the reason we got the word of wisdom is that Emma was tired of scrubbing out tobacco stains on the floor of the School of the Prophets. I was taught that in primary. And I remember in primary thinking, well, that seems very convenient. And my primary teacher said, well, that's how revelation works. You get answers to your questions, and you don't get those answers until you ask the question. So when I see the fact that Joseph Smith's behavior is consistent with the cultural milieu in which he found himself, I just think, how could it be anything else? Of course, that makes perfect sense to me. That is in no way a negative to me. That is a plus to me. It's the idea that if it just sort of sprung out of nowhere, that wouldn't make any sense to me. Although to some degree, it's interesting that the Book of Mormon, and Richard Bushman talks about it, is the Book of Mormon is so radically different from how the saints themselves presented it, right? They presented it at the time as sort of a history of the Indians. And Joseph Smith presented it as a history of the Indians. And yet it's not Native American-y at all. Looking for sort of Native American traditions in it, you find ancient American Christianity instead. The phrase Bushman uses is it refuses to argue its own thesis. It doesn't meet the expectations of what people thought a history of the Native Americans would be.
Right.
Which is I think really kind of interesting, but that's a separate discussion. I first heard about the Rock in the Hat. I did, like you, I grew up completely ignorant of it. I first heard about it on my mission from my mission president, Joseph Fielding Mckonkie, son of Broussard, grandson of Joseph Fielding Smith. And I heard about it dismissively because he said, David Whitmer, years later, says that it was translated with a Seer stone, and that's just absolute nonsense. He's like, David Whitmer just wasn't there. He wouldn't have known. And he said, why would and I think even Jeremy makes this case in the CES letter. He quotes Joseph Fielding Mckonkie because Joseph Fielding Mckonkie says, what a waste of time to get plates if he wasn't looking at the plates, and that doesn't make any sense. So I was first introduced to it by someone who insisted it wasn't true. And he got that sense both from his father and from his grandfather.
Yeah, they thought it was erroneous, uncredible.
They thought it was erroneous. I think one of the reasons the church hasn't taught it is because many leaders of the church refuse to accept it. I don't know when or how the scholarly shift took place, but the church now firmly accepts the historical evidence of the Rock in the Hat. So I think I think the first time I heard it in the sense that the church actually does believe this and teach this came after South Park. I watched the South Park episode. That's how the Book of Mormon was written. Dum, 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 dum. And I was like, no. And then I went and looked and went, oh, well, silly me. It had zero, it didn't go up on the shelf at all for me.
Right, yeah.
It was, oh, well, okay. I mean, it didn't make any difference to me. And I expressed that kind of tone in the CES letter. It's like, this is the huge shelf item that broke Jeremy's shelf almost more than anything else. He mentions it more than anything else. He mentions it 14 times. And it's like, so what? I don't care. It does. The Book of Mormon is still here. The Book of Mormon is still miraculous. Whether he did it through, I mean, the magic spectacles, looking at plates, why is that less weird than looking at a rock in a hat? It just didn't matter to me. It matters to some people, but there are a number of things that I am troubled by that other people aren't troubled by. But this and also the multiple accounts of the first vision, they have never caused me any kind of concern whatsoever. I think they're very, very weak arguments.
Well, we can maybe go there next. I think for those just finishing off the Rock in the Hat, I think for those people who struggle with it the most, we alluded to the fact he used the same Seer stone in treasure digging, and maybe they feel like, oh, was he conning people with that same stone using the same method that I used for the Book of Mormon translation? But I think it's also they maybe just felt going back to that betrayal, they felt like maybe the church either unintentionally or intentionally hid it from
Yeah.
the members of the church, and it's a different narrative. Because I remember watching, the Joseph Smith movie and actually being the plates in front of him and
Yeah.
him looking at the plates, and
Yeah.
that's sort of the way I sort of imagined in my head how it was translated, and it's just very different. But yeah, you could view it as, well, the Urim and Thummim is weird. I thought it was weird when I first learned that it was actual stones and spectacles on my mission. So you could say, is it any weirder than, than the Urim and Thummim?
And I think that's a fair criticism of the church, and that they didn't spread the narrative. I don't think it was dishonesty so much as disagreement, because Joseph Fielding Smith genuinely believed that the sources talking about that were erroneous.
And there's a
Uh,
small pool of apologists who, like the Stoddards, who still reject it, which
yeah,
I find hard to understand because there's multiple witnesses. It's not just
yeah,
Stephen Whitmer. There's Martin Harris,
yeah, yeah.
Joseph
See, and I
Knight.
didn't know that. So when I was first introduced to it, it was, oh, Dave. I can reject, and I do reject, David Whitmer's experience of how the stone worked, where he talks about the words magically appearing, and then David Whitmer is the only account we have of the actual process that demands a tight translation.
Hmm.
I reject that, not because I think David Whitmer was lying, but I think David Whitmer was far enough removed from it that that we should have more contemporaneous sources explaining that that's specifically how the process worked.
I'll
Uh,
double check the sources. I thought there might have been one other, but I'm going off memory. Might have been
I
Joseph.
don't know
I'll
either.
double check
I could be wrong.
after.
But I still insist that whatever happened, Joseph Smith was an active participant. It
Yeah.
required exertion on his part. I really feel like the 8th section of Doctrine and Covenants doesn't leave much room for the idea that all he did was read words off a stone.
Yeah. And
Eh,
unfortunately, Joseph Smith is the one who talks the least about the
yeah,
translation. He's very vague by the gift and power of God. He
yeah. He's
doesn't.
very, very vague. He insists the world doesn't need to know the particulars of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
I'd like to know the particulars. I think it'd be very helpful to solve a lot of problems, but
Yeah.
here we are.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about the first vision. I did a recent interview with historian Stephen Harper, and we talked, quite in depth about the first vision. So maybe we don't need to go super in depth with the different, accounts of the first vision. But there's, four primary accounts: 1832, 35, 38, and 42. Really, critics attack the 1832 account the most. So there's kind of like three main things I'm maybe gonna bring up that I think are maybe the biggest criticisms. One is the fact that Joseph wrote his vision 12 years after the fact, and there's no evidence that, even that I'm aware of people talking about it before 1832, like family members, people in the area, people criticizing him for it, even when early missionaries were first bringing people into the church, because when we were missionaries, I'm assuming it was the same for you on your mission. The first vision was part of the first lesson. It's a huge part of the restoration. Before you even talk about the angel and the gold plates in the Book of Mormon, you talk about Joseph's first vision.
Right.
And that wasn't the case in, 1829, 1830. And they would say, like,
They didn't talk about Joseph at all.
yeah, yeah.
You didn't hear about Moroni either. You didn't hear about Joseph was not discussed in early mission. Bushman makes this very clear.
It's kind of
The
just like
emphasis,
new scripture.
yeah, the emphasis was on new scripture, and the emphasis was on the restoration of spiritual gifts. That we have the capacity to speak in tongues, and we have the capacity to, spiritual gifts were right at the forefront, and we don't talk about those at all anymore, really.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, go ahead. I interrupted you.
No, you got no. Thanks for that. Actually, really good to explain that context. Now, when I read Stephen Harper's book, he talked about, and you address this with Jeremy as well, that Fawn Brodie had the assumption, because when she wrote "No Man Knows My History," there was only the 1838 account, so she thought that he invented the vision 18 years after the fact, when he was experiencing, people questioning his leadership. There's a lot of people who were, apostatizing from the church. and that it didn't happen in 1820. Nobody was talking about it. He made it up. Now we have the other accounts, but even people have this sort of expectation or assumption that after the vision, he would have told his family members, he would have written it down. Why is there no record of the first vision until 12 years later? What would be your response to that?
Well, what did Joseph write down in 1820? What was he writing in 1820 or 1824 or 1828? There's no written record of Joseph Smith's first vision in 1820 because Joseph Smith was essentially illiterate in 1820. Joseph wasn't writing anything. We don't have any papers of Joseph Smith writing about anything until the coming forth of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
We don't have letters, we don't have documents, we don't have journals. Joseph was not writing, period. So the idea, well, how come he didn't write anything down? Well, because he was illiterate. He wasn't a writer. It's why he had Oliver Cowdery as his scribe. He was nervous and incapable of, Emma says he couldn't have written a coherent letter when the time of the Book of Mormon was published. So, I mean, this idea that we should have some kind of 1820 closer documentation, a 14-year-old kid, what did I write down when I was 14 years old? I don't think it even occurred to him to write anything. Now, with regard to the persecution that he says he experienced, Bushman also makes the point, and this is something I didn't realize until I was an adult. Bushman makes the point that one of the reasons that Joseph might have been reticent to talk about the first vision was not that it was so revolutionary, it's that it was so commonplace. You have all kinds of mystics going out into the woods and seeing God, telling them to do all kinds of stuff back then. I mean, that was part of the social milieu.
That was a surprise to me whenever I learned that there's actually so many people who claimed similar visionary experiences of seeing Jesus or seeing the Father and the Son having forgiveness of their sins. I did an episode on it. And yeah, because you kind of think that his experience was this unique theophany. And when he was, telling the minister he got persecuted because it was so unique and like almost like weird and like nobody else was experiencing it, but actually that was sort of like the culture, and there was that visionary mindset in the revivals in early 19th century America.
So that would also help explain why the early members of the church didn't care much. I mean, it wouldn't have been all that useful to them or exciting to them to tell them about just another guy who went out into the woods and had this vision, just like every other spiritualist in the 19th century. It's interesting to note that even in the 1838 version, he talks about his reticence to talk about it. His mother confronts him after he comes back from the sacred grove and asks him what's going on, and he says, "I'm well enough off. I've learned for myself that Presbyterianism is not true." That's all he says.
Yeah.
So even when he's remembering it in the 1838 version, he's also remembering a reticence to talk about it, even with his own family. So I mean, I don't know what people expect him to have done or to have produced, because if we look at the history of the church in 1820, Joseph Smith, after receiving the first vision, still doesn't know anything about the Book of Mormon, still doesn't know anything about the scope of what his calling is supposed to be. He's told that the great and important things are going to be revealed, but the full scope and extent of it, he went out to pray primarily to get a forgiveness of his sins, and he got that. And in the 1832 account, that's the most important thing for him to mention. But it's as he gets older that he understands the greater significance of everything that happened. And so I think that's one of the reasons why you get a sort of more fleshed out account of it. Ways that I don't think Joseph understood the full significance of the vision in 1820. One of the points I make with Jeremy again is that if this were a fabrication, the idea that there are different emphases and different, because I don't think there are contradictions in the four accounts. There really aren't. I mean, people talk, well, they're contradictory. They're not contradictory. The only thing you can point to as a contradiction is that he doesn't mention the Father in the first account. He just says, I saw the Lord.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean he's the only person I saw. Well, this is a long, messy story, but every time the Father appears in Scripture, he appears to introduce the Son, and then he goes away. All of our paintings of the first vision show both of them standing there, and the Father just sort of looking on the whole time. I think what happened was the Father introduced the Son, and then the conversation was with Jesus.
Yeah.
So when he's talking about it, I saw the Lord, he's talking about the bulk of the experience was a one-on-one with him and Jesus. So, and it's only later when he realizes how important it is to everybody else and to the Trinitarian sort of landscape, how important it is to emphasize, no, there were actually two people there, but my conversation was with the Son and not with the Father. But
the church in their gospel topics essay, they say that you could interpret it, as you said, that he's just focusing on the Lord Jesus Christ because he's the one that communes with him and forgives him of his sins and sort of delivers the message. They also say that you could view it as the Lord that opened the heavens could have been God the Father, and then the Lord that communed with him. The Lord opened the heavens and I saw the Lord. And they would point to, the 1835 account, one personage appears first, then followed by another. So, they would say that there's that possible interpretation as well. But I think a critic's interpretation, and Jeremy talks about this, is they would see it as, he refers to two separate personages in the 1835 and 38 accounts because his theology of God evolved from one being to two beings, and he only mentions the Lord because he had either a modalistic or Trinitarian view of God. And they would point to scriptures that reflect that view. I've talked about this a lot with different people, like Robert Boylan, and me and Stephen Harper discussed it. Any thoughts to that sort of criticism?
Well, I think it would be true to say his theology evolved, but
yeah.
But I don't think his experience evolved. So the evolution of the theology would give him an impetus to emphasize the importance of two personages, if that makes sense. His theology evolved to the point where, it's significant that people realize that Christ was introduced by his Father at the beginning of the vision. That's important. People need to know that. In 1832, that wasn't as important to him. What was important is that I saw the Lord and I had my sins forgiven. I don't see any contradiction, by the way, between that and which church to join. I think it was the same question. The idea that you
he was
could
asking both.
Well, he was asking both at the same time. I think it was the same question. I don't think he would have seen a delineation between the two. Which church do I have to join to have my sins forgiven?
Right.
Which, it's a very sort of postmodern idea that you can have a relationship with Christ and not have any relationship with the church. I mean, I don't think that idea would have even occurred to Joseph Smith. I think that's a cultural assumption we're bringing to it. And I think, again, that's more evidence that something actually happened. If Joseph had made this up, if the first vision were a fabrication, then the story would have been exactly the same from beginning to end. You don't remember a fake story in different ways as you're going forward. That's how you remember real stories. You remember real stories and you focus on parts that are important at different times. But a story that he's made up out of whole cloth, I mean, if this is a guy who memorized the Book of Mormon, he can memorize the first vision account and be consistent with it and deliver that over the course of his life. It's significant to note that the 1838 account of the first vision that is canonized was not widely circulated during Joseph Smith's lifetime. Yeah. It didn't really matter to the early saints that much. I think probably the first time most of the early saints would have accounted it would be the 1842 account in the Wentworth letter. That was very public. That was the version. That's incidentally the version that where I discovered there were multiple versions. It was on my mission. And we would show the old hokey version of the First Vision movie where Joseph Smith has a set of seeds and throws them in the air. I will. I showed that movie a bazillion times. And the language in that movie is not the language from the 1832 account. Some of it is, but some of it isn't. And I was like, well, where does this come from? And on my mission, I found an Ensign article that talked about all four accounts of the First Vision. And my reaction was, oh, okay, that's where it came from. And that was it. So again, this is something that has never, ever, ever given me a moment's pause. It's never really been a problem for me. Yeah. And I recognize it's a problem for other people, and we should take that seriously. But I really think...
No, and I have empathy. The First Vision, whenever I was first in my faith crisis and the different accounts and did his theology of God evolve, was one of my biggest issues. It's become, with further research, one where I can see there's ambiguity, there's different interpretations, and I can still see a faithful view. I don't see the First Vision as... first of all, I don't think you can disprove it. There's no smoking gun because it's his own personal vision. So I don't think we can even if we try to catch him out, I don't think we can disprove it. You can't disprove if I were to claim to have a vision. But hammering on the point, because I want to sort of like represent critics and what Jeremy's saying a little bit like deeper. In the 1832 account, Joseph says he came to the conclusion pretty much himself from studying the scriptures there was no denomination built upon the gospel of Jesus Christ as found in the New Testament. And then, he didn't know where else to turn to for mercy. And then he cried to God for mercy, seeking a forgiveness of sins. In that account, it seems like he already came to the conclusion himself, there's no true church. And that's why he goes to the grove seeking forgiveness of sins. That's the question. Contrast that with 1838. His object in inquiring of the Lord was to know, which of all the churches was right, which sect was right, to know which he should join. And then there's that scripture that Jeremy points to, that when the Lord tells him that none of them are right, join none of them, he says, oh, it never entered into my heart, none of them were wrong. And he would say, well, hold on, in 1832, he writes that he came to the conclusion himself from reading the scriptures, there's no true church. And then he says, oh, it never entered into my heart. And a critic would say, is that a contradictory statement? I'd like to get your sort of thoughts on that more specifically. I've talked about this with Stephen Harper and his view, but I think you're right. In the 1835 account, he does talk about both forgiveness of his sins and which church to join. There's also a secondhand account from, I think it's Orson Pratt, that talks about both. So I do see that as a possible interpretation, that maybe it's not an either or, but critics would say that 1832 and 1838, that they seem a little bit in contradiction.
Well,
quick thoughts?
Well, my thought on that contradiction is that it was the same question. I mean, I don't know how he worded it. I don't know what he said. I mean, I mean, trying to get a transcript of the First Vision is foolhardy.
Yeah.
But to him, the idea of which church to join or how to get a forgiveness of my sins was essentially the same question. And so I don't think he would have seen that as anything close to a contradiction.
Right.
But in terms of the, it had never entered into my heart that they were all wrong. If that contradicts the 1832 account, it also contradicts a similar thing that Joseph Smith writes 6 verses earlier in that same 1838 account.
Yeah, Stephen Harper talked about that.
Which of the churches is true, or are they all wrong together? And the fact that he uses the description of it never entered into my heart means that he had entertained it as an intellectual possibility, but it wasn't really convicted of it. He didn't really have a testimony of it, I guess, is our modern term of it. It hadn't entered into his heart that really they all could possibly be wrong. Intellectually, he had considered that possibility, but it he didn't really accept it until that moment.
Yeah.
I mean, if that's not the way to read it, then you have to deal with it with a contradiction in the 1838 account itself, because that uses both of those languages. So clearly something different is going on intellectually and emotionally in terms of how Joseph is processing that information.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's great. Do you want to talk a little bit about the Book of Abraham?
Sure.
Let's
The
do
Book
it.
of Abraham, the Book of Abraham is clearly the strongest argument the critics have against the church.
Yeah.
I
I
I
probably maybe agree with that. It's probably one of my
I
biggest shelf items.
it's interesting because when I first wrote the CES letter reply, um, Brian Howglid,
Yeah.
uh, who was the editor of the Joseph Smith papers about the Book of Abraham documents, and was a faithful professor at BYU and an apologist for a long time, uh, wrote a thing saying that his apologetic work was now abhorrent to
Of
him,
John Guillen, Harry
and the work of
Molstein.
John Gee and Kerry Molstein is abhorrent, and has completely rejected all of his own apologetic writings and their apologetic writings on the Book of Abraham. I
Yeah.
first found out about that statement when I was on a podcast with Bill Reel talking about,
Okay.
and we were talking about the Book of Abraham. He says, "Have you heard this from Brian Howglid?" And read it to me, and I was just sort of floored. I didn't have an answer for it. I've since met Brian Howglid. I was introduced by Brian Howglid by Jeremy Runnels, interestingly enough.
Is he still in the church, by the way, Brian Howglid? What's the
Uh,
crack with him?
I don't know. I mean, I did not have an extensive discussion with him, and I certainly wouldn't want to speak for him.
Okay, that's fine.
I don't think he's had his name removed. My guess is that
Because I wasn't sure maybe if he just moved to the catalyst theory camp
well,
versus
yeah,
the
I mean, that's what he had essentially did, but I would think now, I don't know. I don't want to speak for him. I don't know him well enough, and
That's
I don't
fine.
want
That's
to.
fine.
Um, but I think it was a tremendous blow to his faith, to work on the Joseph Smith papers and come to the realization that the critics' arguments that yes, the documents we have are the documents that Joseph Smith thought he was translating to
Yeah.
produce the Book of Abraham.
That,
They
that
are
was a
very
huge light bulb moment for me. So I'm not an expert when it comes to the Book of Abraham, when it comes to DNA. I'm not the smartest guy. And Book
right,
of Abraham was never one of my biggest issues with faith crisis because I just get lost when it comes to Egyptology. But maybe we could
right.
talk briefly about the Book of Abraham, sort of like what it is and the controversy. We could talk about maybe a couple of the questions, and then we could talk about sort of like long scroll theory versus catalyst theory, and talk a little bit about Brian Howglid's sort of realization.
Yeah. So, well, just I think most of your viewers would probably know this, but you had a guy who brought a bunch of mummies into Kirtland.
Michael
Uh,
Chandler, wasn't it? That was his name.
Michael Chandler, yeah. And Joseph Smith paid almost $2,500 for him. Got the church to pay $2,500 for him, which is
Huge amount.
huge amount of money. At a time when the church was in poverty stricken, they're trying to build the Kirtland Temple. So this was this huge outlay of money, and but it contained scrolls with writings on them that Joseph insisted were the writings of Abraham
And
and
Joseph.
Joseph of Egypt.
Yeah.
So and that he was going to translate them. The process of translation happened in fits and starts. I don't know. I mean, I'm going to get all this wrong as I lay out the history. But there's some controversy as to how much was translated in Kirtland and how
Yeah.
much was translated later in Nauvoo, because the Book of Abraham wasn't published in the Times and Seasons until I think 1842.
Yeah.
And
There's a lot of controversy over that because I think the Joseph Smith Papers project, those who are working on that, they would side with he started in 1835, completed in 1842. I think Guy and Milstein believe it was all in 1835, and I think that
Yeah.
would tie in with the the Kirtland Egyptian papers.
Yeah. See,
We talked about
so
that.
the Kirtland Egyptian papers are the things that everybody's the real controversy there, because the Kirtland. Oh, I don't know how important this is, but
I think it's kind of important. I think it's kind of important.
so there so there are a bunch of there are documents where you have characters taken from the Joseph Smith papyrus, although many of them, if not most of them, are not taken from the extant papyrus that we have. But you have these characters, and then you have lengthy paragraphs next to these characters that suggest that these characters were being translated into those lengthy paragraphs. So the idea is that they did that as part of the translation, or that they were reverse engineering the translation.
Yeah.
That they were taking text from the Book of Abraham and saying, well, this is the character that produced that text.
I don't know if Jeremy gets into that too much in
A
his
little
CES
bit.
letter, maybe in his second version.
So I will say this: Jeremy's section and my response to his section are both extraordinarily lazy, because Jeremy takes, and I make fun of him for it. Jeremy took there's a guy named
Robert
Kevin
Matthews,
Matthew, who's a musician.
or Kevin Matthews. Okay.
Yeah, and he wrote up something about this, and Jeremy just cuts and pastes it and passes it along. And it's like, Kevin Matthews not an Egyptologist. Where did he get his information? And so I lazily point to that, but it doesn't deal with the underlying problem, which is that if Jeremy were really writing a scholarly thing, he would quote Robert Rittner, as opposed to Kevin Matthew, because Robert Rittner is an actual Egyptologist who went through the Book of Abraham and said, here's why it's nonsense. And so
yeah, because essentially we have fragments of the papyri.
Yeah. So the end of the story is we had all this papyrus that it was translated from. There was a fire and it all burned up. Everybody thought, and so
Chicago fire. Yeah.
There was no way to match it with the translation with the actual papyrus. And then in the 60s, 67, I think the Metropolitan Museum of Art found pieces of the papyrus pressed behind glass.
Yeah.
Discovered what it was, and they gave it back to the church. And this papyrus was very clearly had nothing to do with Abraham. It was a standard funerary document. The Book of the Dead and two funerary documents: the Book of the Dead and the Book of Breathings.
Yeah, that's right.
And the thing that really hurt the church is that on one of the documents you have a piece of the first facsimile of Abraham on the altar, was part of this document, which strongly suggests that the text next to it was the text that Joseph Smith used to produce the Book of Abraham, that he thought he was translating. And the text next to it bears no resemblance whatsoever to the Book of Abraham and has nothing to do with it. So apologists have gone up, down, and sideways and said, well, sometimes, on a lot of documents, illustrations will be next to text that it is talking about, and sometimes it won't. And John Gee insists that we only got part of the and it's true, we only have a relatively small percentage of the total material. And so they insist that there was a long scroll that did have the text of the Book of Abraham on it, but Robert Rittner really kind of makes mincemeat of that.
Yeah, because I think he believes, I watched his interview with John Dillon, that there's maybe only a couple of feet missing, and he feels like there's not the rest of the Book of Abraham on there. Because whenever I sort of my faith journey when it comes to Book of Abraham, whenever I first went through my faith crisis, I thought the catalyst theory, I didn't buy that theory. I kind of
Right.
thought that was a weak theory, almost because I kind of thought like it's kind of indistinguishable from fraud. It's like saying like he claimed that he translated, the Book of Abraham, and then we find out, okay, the papyrus, the characters on the papyrus fragments doesn't match the text of the Book of Abraham, and then you say, oh well, it was just a catalyst. It inspired him to receive the revelation. Okay, possible, maybe. But then my critical brain was like, well, you could say that about anything or anyone. If he produced a translation of the Kinderhook plates, even though they're a hoax, if he had produced a text on that, you could go back to the callus theory. So I always thought that was a weak argument. When I came back to
Yeah.
the church, I bought into the long scroll theory. I listened to John Gee's sort of apologetics on it, and I was like, oh yeah, those people refer to a long scroll. We don't have all the scroll. Maybe he was translating from a different part. Like you said, and I think they refer to some papyrus that it's not always the text around the facsimile is the text, in relation to it. So perhaps that is it. But then when we talk about the Kirtland Egyptian papers, Dan Vogel and Robert Rittner talk about how they are translating from some of those characters which we have around
Right.
the
Right.
facsimile. And then, like you said, Robert Rittner doesn't believe, and I don't think Dan Vogel believes that the accounts of the really long scroll hold up. And it's most
Yeah.
likely it was maybe a couple of feet which are missing, which for me, this is only me understanding this in the past year or two. Because it's a big complicated issue, but it's made me think that Joseph Smith believed that the papyrus he had was the Book of Abraham and was doing a literal translation with his scribes, translating it. And I know Carrie Milstein and John Gee try to talk about the reverse translation theory. So he dictated the revelation first, and then it was his scribes after trying to match the
Yeah.
the characters with his translation.
Yeah.
And any comments on that?
Well, that's Hugh Nibley's theory too, and the long scroll theory often comes from Hugh Nibley, and it's a
Yeah.
family account. It's a
Yeah.
second hand. I mean, they describe rolling these scrolls through the mansion house, filling up floors.
Yeah.
Uh, I don't buy into that at all.
No, me
Uh,
neither.
uh, so uh, where I've landed on this, because again, I think it is the strongest argument against the church, or at least against Joseph Smith's abilities as a translator. Where I've landed is, if it were not for the Book of Mormon, I wouldn't give the Book of Abraham the time of day.
Right.
The
Yeah.
reason I'm willing to even consider a catalyst theory or anything else is that the Book of Mormon still stands in my mind as a miraculous product of Joseph Smith's gifts and abilities as a translator and a revelator. And so with that, I say, okay, so what was happening here? There are two other supposedly ancient documents within the church that are canonized, in one in the Doctrine and Covenants and one in the Pearl of Great Price, for which Joseph Smith had no manuscript. They are the Book of Moses, which is a product of Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible, and supposedly the writings of Moses.
Yeah.
Now, at no time did Joseph Smith claim to physically have any kind of writing of Moses. But here we have the Book of Moses, and we don't argue as to whether or not it's an accurate translation. We recognize you either accept that he received this by revelation or you don't. You accept it fully, wholly as a revelation rather than as the kind of translation that we expect from the Book of Abraham. The second is a papyrus scroll that Joseph Smith references that talks about the final fate of John the Beloved, that constitutes the 7th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, where we find out John is wandering and changing tires alongside the three Nephites, that he's a translated being who's never left the earth. The thing that bothers me about that is, okay, if Peter, James, and John came down and restored the Melchizedek priesthood, did Peter and James come down from heaven and John showed up in a canoe because he's still wandering the earth? And then that's a whole other, anyway.
Right.
But But both of those are supposedly ancient records that Joseph received wholly by revelation without any kind of a physical catalyst. Well, I guess you could say the Bible was a physical catalyst for the Book of Moses, but no kind of ancient document from which he translated. I have to believe that the Book of Abraham's value can only be attributed to a similar sort of circumstance. That if this was the trigger for a revelation that came from Abraham, if this is an inspired midrash, I think that's a possibility. That this wasn't written by Abraham, but like some scripture, it was attributed to Abraham. But the only way to do that is to say that this came as a revelation to Joseph Smith, like the other things. And so that's now.
Do you believe that Joseph Smith believed he was literally translating the papyrus? Yeah,
I do. Okay. I absolutely.
I would lean that way as well.
I mean, that's Dan Vogel's pious fraud. And so then you have to allow for the possibility that Joseph was wrong. You have to allow for the possibility that God knew Joseph well enough to know that it would be easier for him to accept this kind of revelation if this is the way that it came, if he felt like he was translating an ancient document. It was the catalyst not just for that revelation, but it was also a catalyst for Joseph to instigate the school of the prophets and to learn Hebrew and to actually try to become a scholar and to gain a bunch of, I think there were a lot of good things that came from this. But yeah, I think that Joseph, this stuff had nothing to do with the Book of Abraham. The actual papyrus is not the Book of Abraham. Now, at the same time, so this is the Jim Bennett theory, coming from a guy with no Egyptological training, none of that. And I put this actually, I've since, because after I got caught flat-footed by Bill Reel in that podcast, I've since gone back to look at my Book of Abraham section in the CES Letter reply and go, geez, I must be full of crap. And realize, oh, you know what? I really think I still believe this. And my theory that I outline in that is what I call sort of the reappropriation of symbols over time. You know, the papyrus that Joseph Smith had was written from the Ptolemaic period, which is thousands of years after the Book of Abraham, which means that, you know, the facsimiles that are interpreted different ways, it is very possible that the symbols and the ideas that you see in those facsimiles could have been repurposed over time. And at the time they were passed down to the Ptolemaic period, they meant something markedly different than what they would have meant thousands of years earlier. And so
you're saying the way Egyptologists today translate and interpret the facsimiles may not have been the case 2,000 years ago or during Abraham's day? Is that
well, what I think is that you have sort of an accretion of ideas, like in geology, you have symbols and ideas that layer upon layer upon layer is piled on them, and eventually becomes the Egyptian Book of the Dead to some degree over the course of thousands of years. But there's a kernel of that, at its heart of that, there were symbols and ideas that Joseph the seer could have lifted off all of the layers and found again. And so I mean, I am open to the possibility that the Book of the Dead and the Book of Breathings may have had as one of their sources a Book of Abraham, similar to what we have now. I mean, if you're willing to say that the Book of Mormon is based on the Book of Hebrew, the view of the Hebrews, you know, it's the same sort of thing. These kinds of ideas were floating around for thousands of years,
right?
Until these documents were written, and Joseph is getting back to the first draft. I've sort of embraced that, and I've done so with no scholarly credibility or credentials that should give that any weight to anybody else.
Yeah, I was going to ask, do you feel like that's I don't want to say irrational, but do you think that's a evidence-based, or do you think that's more of a sort of theory-based sort of
The
interpretation?
evidence, no, the evidence is quite compelling that the Book of Abraham is not what Joseph said it was.
Yes, yeah,
I mean, I think we have to acknowledge that.
yeah,
I think we, in order to be able to have faith, we have to say, okay, given that evidence, and I mean, there could be, tomorrow a long scroll appears and proves us all wrong and all of that kind of stuff. But the reality is, yeah, the evidence seems pretty clear that the Book of Abraham is not what Joseph Smith said it was.
yeah.
Now,
I appreciate you saying that, because I feel like you're actually being very intellectually honest and fair, which I appreciate, because I was going to bring up whenever I read your CS letter response, and you acknowledged that it was a bit lazy. I found it misleading, and I think it's good that you are acknowledge aspects, parts of it, maybe not the whole, but
well,
parts of it. And I think it's good that
I don't think there's any. If it's misleading, I don't think there's any place in there where it's intentionally misleading.
yeah,
I do think that the Book of Abraham section was written. I know more now than I did when I first wrote that.
yeah,
I would admit that it's lazy because and I talked about this with John DeLynn. It's like because John DeLynn was saying, well, look, Robert Rittner, and all this, and I'm like, yeah, except for I wasn't dealing with Robert Rittner. I was dealing with Kevin Matthey, and I was dealing with Jeremy Runnels. And the argument Jeremy Runnels presents is really pretty weak
mm,
and lazy and unexamined. Jeremy Runnels has not read his own source materials on this. And so I picked it off by saying, look, you're saying only an Egyptologist can weigh in on this, and the guy you're quoting isn't an Egyptologist.
I
And
think
that's about as
Nemo,
deep as my argument gets.
I think when he fact checked the "this is the show" video, whenever I had a look as well, Nemo was saying how yes, he's citing, that guy. What was it, Kevin Matthews or
Kevin
Rob?
Matthey, yeah.
Yeah, but Kevin Matthey is referencing Egyptologists and compiling it together. So although yes, he's not quoting directly an Egyptologist, if he's quoting someone who's compiling Egyptologists'
No,
explanation, does
I
that
don't
make
think
it
that
uncredible?
I don't think that lets Kevin Matthey off the hook, because Kevin Matthey never tells you who his sources are. He says this is what Egyptologists say. Nowhere does he say which Egyptologists. Nowhere does he give you a footnote.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just this is what Kevin Matthey's big thing is he draws in the missing parts of facsimile 1 and gives the guy with the knife a jackal's head instead of a human head, and says this is what this should look like. But there is no facsimile that looks like that. In all the facsimiles where you have a jackal holding a knife, you have a sarcophagus on the table. You don't have a live body. In facsimile 1, you have a live body. And that's very different from a lot of these other facsimiles. But I don't think Kevin Matthey gets off the hook here.
Mm.
I think the way, if Jeremy, he eventually went back and did a link to Robert Rittner, just a single sort of, he says, since then, Robert Rittner's talked to John DeLynn, and he's done a study, and go read that.
Because I think Robert Rittner's view would be the priest whose head is missing on the Joseph Smith papyrus, he believed it was the jackal-headed god Anubis.
Yeah. But that was actually a kind of a faith building moment for me. And that when I went digging through this, it was because in Jeremy in the CES letter, he's like, this is what they all look like. And if you go look at all of Jeremy's examples, they don't look anything like facsimile 1, because you don't have a live body on the altar. You have this big King Tut coffin sitting there on a table.
Mm.
And it's like, if everything's supposed to look like this, then why can't you show me anything that looks like this? So that was kind of interesting to me. Hugh Nibley leans into that pretty hard.
Right.
So I but I'm not an Egyptologist. I'm not qualified to weigh in on a lot of this stuff.
Yeah,
And
no, that's totally fair. I'd love to bring on, someone like Carrie Milstein or John Gee or Stephen Smoot or someone like that to really have a good in-depth
I
discussion, because I'm with you. Some elements can go over my
yeah.
understanding and expertise.
So I have met Carrie Milstein, and I've had a lengthy conversation with Stephen Smoot. I like both of them. I
Yeah,
know Stephen Smoot really gets under Jeremy's skin, but I think Stephen Smoot is unbelievably brilliant, and I think that I mean I think the Book of Abraham, i.e., the text, the what we have printed in our scriptures, is magnificent. I love it. I love the weirdness of it. I love Kolob. I love, all that kind of stuff. I think it's the clearest indication we have of a doctrine of preexistence, the clearest understanding of it. So I treasure the Book of Abraham, the content of it. And so uh, I recognize that my willingness to accept that requires me to accept that Joseph Smith was mistaken when he thought that what he had physically was the Book of Abraham.
yeah. Okay. Jim, do you want to keep going, or do you want to have a quick break, and maybe after we can tackle, I think it's priesthood restoration, witnesses, and
Well,
polygamy next.
so how long do we want to go here? Because my wife is going to come home and be mad that I haven't cleaned the bathroom. Um, can we schedule another time to do
Yeah, yeah, we
more
can.
length? I mean,
Yeah,
what time is it over there? You're in Northern Ireland, aren't you?
yeah, it's 10 to 11.
Yeah. Do you want to do we want to schedule something else so
Yeah,
we can?
if you want, we could reschedule for another day and bring you back on.
I mean, I didn't realize it was going to be this long,
You should
but
have
I can't
known
shut
after
up.
your interview with Bill O'Reilly and John Dehlin.
Right. Well, we broke those up. I mean, I didn't sit there for 14 hours with them.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, I mean, I did over time, but I sat there for 2 or 3 hours with them in each session. Um, when is good for you?
How about we'll finish the recording, then we can schedule another time, maybe some time the next week or so. But Jim, thanks so much for coming on and for this dialogue that we've been having. It's been really good. Everyone check out his faithful response to a CS letter. And also I'll put links where you can watch him on Mormonism Live, Mormon Stories, and the Mormon Discussions podcast. If people want to get in contact with you, Jim, is there a way that they could reach
Send
out
me
to
an
you?
email. I'm at jim@canonizer.com.
Okay,
CANONIZER.com.
awesome. I'll put a link in the description for that. And thanks just everyone for watching. If you enjoy this, give it a thumbs up, like, share, and subscribe to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph. We'll see you back on the next part as we continue looking at the CS letter. Thanks, Jim.
All
Take
right,
care.
thank you. Yeah, so get in touch and we'll schedule something else. But this has been really fun.
Perfect.